I'm Jeff Randall. Tonight, the banks on the brink. They've received billions of our cash, but still won't lend it out. In desperation, the government's throwing yet more taxpayers' money at the system. But is it enough to yank open those vaults? The banks have been labelled greedy and reckless. Now, in an exclusive interview, Victor Blank, the boss of Britain's new superbank, tells me if he and his colleagues are guilty as charged. Lloyds Banking Group became a reality today after it formally absorbed HBOS. But there's been no time for celebration as the dismal state of British banking becomes ever more evident. Gordon Brown says he's furious that the banks have failed to come clean about the extent of the losses they've made on bad loans. But despite his anger, the Prime Minister's given the go-ahead to a second deluge of cash for the banks in just 3 months.
I will not sit idly by and let people go to the wall because of the irresponsible mistakes of a few bankers. Good businesses must have access to credit. Jobs should not be lost needlessly. It is because of this that we are taking the action to expand lending that we are outlining today.
So the British taxpayer is betting hundreds of billions just to get the banks to start behaving like, well, banks. Gordon Brown says he's doing it not to save wealthy financiers from the scrap heap, but to rescue our economy.
This is a very big bazooka they've let off today, and let's hope very much that this does the trick. It's my expectation would be that this will stabilise what was becoming a critical position for ordinary companies up and down the land. This will provide a real degree of stability.
But are we simply chasing our losses? The markets have given the bailout plans a big thumbs down. The share price of RBS nosedived today. The bank lost 2/3 of its already depleted value. Full-blown nationalisation may not be far away. Taxpayers already have a 43% stake in Lloyds Banking Group, formed by Lloyds TSB's takeover of HBOS, which came close to collapse in October. At the time, the two banks needed $17 billion in emergency funding just to stay afloat. Even so, directors seemed determined to resist creeping control by the government. The new Lloyds Superbank has 3,000 branches, with a total of 30 million customers. Their savings amount to £220 billion. The banks have wiped unimaginable amounts from their shareholders' investments, and yet analysts continue to fret that there could be even more dark secrets lurking in toxic loan books. This is not the start that Britain's newest superbank had hoped for. Well, welcome Sir Victor Blank, the chairman of that superbank. Thanks for coming in on what was a tough day. Tell us, after all we've seen and heard today, it's pretty clear, isn't it, that this country's commercial banks have wrecked the nation's finances?
No, I don't accept that. I think we're in the middle of a global economic downturn of great severity, much more severe than anything we've seen before. Some banks have played a role in accelerating the downturn.
British banks have played that role.
Some, but much more international banks, much more the investment banks.
So it's all somebody else's fault?
No, let me finish. I don't accept it's wholly everybody else's fault. I think that banks have made mistakes. I think they've made mistakes in some of the instruments that have been peddled around the world. I think they've made mistakes in being greedy and venal. I mean, you've heard all these descriptions.
And would you say that that's fair? Greedy and venal?
And I think it is true of some banks, but you cannot generalise over them. And if I can simply talk about the bank that I know best, which is Lloyds, we have continued to lend money. We lent more money in 2008 than in 2007. We will lend more money in 2009 than in 2008. We look after our customers. We've been able to fund ourselves. So I'm not saying we've done everything perfectly, but I think that the mistakes that have been made, the lack of confidence that has gone throughout the system, the lack of confidence that's led to latterly the decline in the slump in share prices today, comes from a much broader, generalised and international problem.
You see, a lot of people see it as nothing less than financial vandalism. This is why. £37 billion was pumped into the system last October. I think your combined group got something like 17 billion, HBOS and Lloyds. when you look at proper numbers out there in the real world, the entire defence budget is only about 32, 33 billion. So all that money, more than the entire defence budget, has been pumped into the banks. They've sort of swallowed, burped and said, yes, please, we'll have some more.
Jeff, the money has gone into the banks, that's right. It's not gone into the banks for themselves, it's gone into the banks to encourage them to lend money, to make sure that they've got both the liquidity and the capital base to lend. And that was true of that extraordinary weekend in October when the government decided that to restore confidence in the banking system, it would over-capitalise all the banks. And that's essentially what it did. With the benefit of hindsight, some of the structure that went in there was not as effective as it should have been to enable the banks to lend. And if I can just briefly tell you that it's one thing to put capital into the banks, that's fine. But if at the same time you tighten the capital ratios, in other words, the constraints around the banks lending, then they're not able to do it. And there was some.
What wasn't that part of the problem? It was a flawed structure because the banks, are being charged 12% on the money that the government's put in, but you're being asked to lend out at much lower rates, 2 to 3%. So if you're being charged 12% and lending out at 3 or 4%, that's not a business model that's going to work, is it?
That's not the problem. The 12% is being charged on the preference shares. We and HBOS, if you take us together, i.e. Lloyds Banking Group, have £4 billion. So the cost to our P&L account is considerable in hundreds of millions, but is not the total issue, is not the reason why we're not lending money. The problem was around the constraints on capital ratios.
All right.
But let me just come back and say, we have been lending money, we continue to lend money, and we will continue to lend money, and we've been able to fund ourselves pretty effectively.
Do you? And does that include the bank that you now run, HBOS? Let me read you something the Chancellor said on radio this morning. He said banks' boards don't have the discipline to do the right thing. What did he mean, don't have the discipline? Greed? Recklessness? You're now running, Sir Victor, HBOS, a bank which all but collapsed. What went wrong there? Where was the lack of discipline?
I think that what went wrong with HBOS in broad terms was that the model which required HBOS to fund itself out of the interbank market,
so borrowing from other banks,
deposits, borrowing from other banks, was something on which it was wholly dependent. And that market evaporated in a way that nobody would ever have anticipated. And the result was that the model which had been in place for HBOS and Bank of Scotland, I mean, it really goes back to Bank of Scotland days, just couldn't cope.
The banks are regulated, in effect, by the government. The government sets up the regulatory system. Regulation clearly failed. Why did it fail?
I think there are areas in which regulation has failed.
Areas?
No.
Northern Rock fell through the crack in the floorboards.
Northern Rock is the principal example, and the FSA have admitted it. Nobody saw that that was a flawed business model. I mean, to be lending 125% of value on houses just doesn't make sense. Any kind of downturn, anybody realises that's going to be a problem. Did regulation fail in relation to HBOS? I don't know. I mean,
it was a similar model, was it not?
No.
It was borrowing too much from the wholesale markets?
It was borrowing too much from the wholesale markets, which is rather different from Northern Rock, which was lending too much on values. So I think it was very different. HBOS's problem was really about the model. It was about the dependence on the interbank markets. Nobody really could ever have expected the trauma that went through the banking. And what had happened was, I mean, to come back to it, it was lack of confidence in the whole of the banking sector. And in the preamble you referred to lack of transparency. There's an element of that. If you don't know what's in a bank, then you cease to trust it.
Why don't the banks come clean? Why are they not telling us what's really going on?
Well, this bank has come clean. We showed 12 months ago exactly what we had got in terms of any kind of toxic assets.
Including HBOS. So everything's out there.
We didn't own HBOS then.
But is everything out there on HBOS now?
I believe that everything is out there as far as HBOS is concerned. They've made, I think, 3 or 4 statements over the course of the last year explaining exactly what their financial position is.
OK. The government now owns 43% of your bank and about 70% of Royal Bank of Scotland. Why is it messing around, given that it wants to force the banks to do things? Why doesn't it just nationalise? Surely it's the best plan. What's against nationalisation now?
Well, I think that we can probably conduct our business better than the government can conduct it for us.
Hang on a minute. You HBOS,
well, I can speak
Royal
for,
Bank of Scotland can conduct business better than the bank. I think even this government could do better.
I can speak for Lloyds TSB, and the reason why we're at 43% and we don't want to go any higher is that we believe that that is better for our customers, that we are more secure, that we're safer, that we can give them a greater range of products. We believe it's better for our staff, it gives them better prospects, and we believe that in time it will be better for our shareholders. So we want to see the government, albeit it's there as a shareholder and was needed in order to bridge a very difficult financial position, we're happy to see it there, but with less than 50%, so that I and the rest of the board can speak for all shareholders, not just for one.
OK, Sir Victor, thanks for that. Don't go away, will you? Because we're going to come back to you in the second half of the show. This is the show where we interview the top movers and shakers in business and politics. If you want to see previous interviews, such as those with the Chancellor and Barclays boss John Varley, go to skynews.com/Jeff Randall. You'll also find comprehensive coverage of the recession on the Sky News website. This is Jeff Randall Live. Coming up after the break, is the Black Horse still a thoroughbred or heading for the Knackers Yard? More from our exclusive interview with Sir Victor Blank, the chairman of Britain's newest super bank. Welcome back to Jeff Randall Live. In a moment, more from our special guest, top banker Sir Victor Blank. First, the top stories. Bank shares have plummeted as the government launched its latest plan to get banks lending. The chairman of the Lloyds Banking Group, Sir Victor Blank, has told Sky News all of the losses made by HBOS have been made public. Final preparations are taking place for Barack Obama's inauguration. More than 1 million people are expected in Washington tomorrow. But Israel insists that it will have pulled out all its forces from Gaza by tomorrow afternoon. So let's resume the conversation I was having before the break with our boss of Lloyds Banking Group, Sir Victor Blank. Sir Victor, you're still here. That's marvellous. When you did that deal with HBOS, I think it was in September, only 4 months ago, did you really know what you were getting into? Did you really do due diligence, or were you just schmoozed by the Prime Minister to fix it?
No, Jeff. I've said this a number of times and I'll say it again. This was a decision that we'd made. This is something we've wanted to do and talked about for years, not just months. And the current set of discussions began in late July. The thing that was important as far as the Prime Minister was concerned was that he had to believe that HBOS was in a serious state, that rescue by us was the right thing to do, and therefore had to be prepared to ease the competition rules to allow that to happen. Okay. Because there's no way that HBOS, perhaps even we, could have sat for 12 months with the uncertainty surrounding a Competition Commission investigation.
OK.
Now, so that's the answer to one bit of it. The other bit is, do I believe it's a good deal and do we want to do it? Absolutely. I did then and I still do now. As I said a little bit earlier, I think it's good for our shareholders ultimately. I mean, you may say today isn't the best day to be saying that, but I do ultimately believe that. I think it's good for the consumer, who will have a very strong, secure bank. I think it's good for the country. We'll have a great UK financial services institution, which will be strong and which in time I think can expand overseas.
Sir Victor, don't tell me that you wouldn't, given the opportunity, rewind the video and have another go. Your shareholders will think you're mad. The acquisition, the takeover of HBOS has smashed Lloyds shareholder value to pieces.
Yes, it smashed every other bank's shares, whether it's a UK bank, a European bank, an American bank, a Chinese bank, to pieces. I mean, that's a consequence of what's happened with the economy.
But it was HBOS, not you. In fairness to Lloyds, Lloyds was a well-run, conservatively run bank before that. It was HBOS that was doing all the fancy casino stuff, and now that has come and is resting very heavily on your shoulders.
Well,
surely you wouldn't go
I
for
hope
that
you'll
again.
invite me back and we can run this
definitely.
with the benefit of hindsight. But
I'll
in
take
my
it
view,
on the chin.
And it's the view of the whole of my board as well, that this deal will prove to be an extremely good one. All right. For Lloyds TSB, now Lloyds Banking Group.
To make it work, and this is true of most big mergers, you're going to have to cut costs and you're certainly going to have to cut jobs, aren't you? How many will go? 20,000, 30,000?
Well, we've been asked that question before, and what we've said is that over the course of the next 3 years, we expect to get savings of at least £1.5 billion per annum. Most of that will come from back office operations, IT, and so on, where you can amalgamate all of that between two very large institutions and make great savings. We hope over the 3-year period that a lot of the jobs that will be lost, and there will be some lost, will go by attrition and natural wastage. There may be some that have to go by means of redundancy, voluntary and compulsory. We don't know how many.
But are you
that will
thousands?
be something. That will be something that will come through the process of working through, in a business-like and professional way, how the synergies will be taken. I'm not going to speculate on a number.
I'd like to be with some of your shareholders now, because as well as a diminishment in the value of the bank, that's happened because the share price has fallen. Your shareholders over many years, that's Lloyds shareholders, were used to generous dividend payments. Many had come to rely on them. The dividend has now been stopped. All that's gone. In that sense, you have let down your shareholders, because this deal is behind that block on the divvies.
The divvies would have gone anyway, Jeff. In what's happened in the current climate, the economic climate and so on, the dividend would have gone anyway for a period. There is indeed, as you rightly say, a dividend blocker attached to the preference shares, but we expect to be in a position to get that removed, we've said, within the course of 2009. But I doubt that we'd have been paying a dividend in 2009 anyway.
It wouldn't have been seemly.
I don't think it would have been seemly.
Aside from Lloyds, your partner bank, I suppose we can call it that, HBOS now, it had a very different way of doing business, didn't it? As I said, you were a very conservative, largely a consumer bank. Towards the end of its independence, it played very, very big in business banking. It wasn't just lending to partners, it was investing alongside them. It was punting, it was having a go, and that's why it's got all these bad losses. How are you going to clean all that up? How are you going to change all that culture? Within
HBOS, you have got the largest, perhaps arguably the most successful mortgage lender in Halifax. You've got a very successful bank in Bank of Scotland. You've got good names like Clerical and Medical. You've got a very high quality cache of businesses and of brands within that. The mortgage book is a very solid mortgage book of HBOS. It's a good book. The loan to value ratio is something, I don't know, 50, 60%, that sort of order.
So it's the business book.
There was a corporate element which you refer to, based largely out of Scotland, which did take a fairly aggressive stance and made an awful lot of money for HBOS for a period of time. And we know that there are some issues in there, but we have bought the business for the brands, for the strength of its business, for the savings customers it's got, for the mortgage customers it's got. That's where the value and the attraction is.
Okay. The government keeps banging on about this idea that the banks aren't lending. The whole bailout plan, if I can put it that way today, is all about driving more lending.
Yep.
Are you doing your bit? Is Lloyds really lending to customers as it's always done?
Well, we are. I mean, I can give you an anecdote. I mean, I went to my local pub at the weekend and the manager came over to me and said how pleased he'd been that the Lloyds manager turned up and offered him some more money. So, yes, we're anecdotal. We're out lending money, and we're lending money to small, medium-sized businesses. In 2008...
So if Gordon Brown calls up today, you'll say, Gordon, don't give me your grief. It's not us, it's somebody else.
No, we'll do more. It's not primarily us. Our lending to small and medium-sized companies was up 20% in 2008, and in the mortgage market it was up 10%, and it'll be up this year. Can we do more? Yes, we can do more. I talked to you earlier about some of the capital constraints around us. With the benefit of the insurance scheme that the government have now introduced, some of that constraint will go, and there will be the opportunity to do more lending. And frankly, what the government are doing is encouraging the banks to lend money in order to soften the extent of the recession. And I think socially that is the right thing to do.
OK. Let's go back to HBOS. A couple of years ago, 3 years ago, it was worth more than £20 billion. In September, it was worth £12 billion. I think even you would admit if it were alone today, it would be worth zero. HBOS went from an enormous business to nothing. People out there look at this and they say it was all an illusion.
But it's true of the Royal Bank of Scotland. It's true Barclays and we have lost value. And if you look at the market today, I mean, because I've never seen a market crash like I saw in the banking shares today. It's all about lack of confidence, real lack of confidence. When I was a lad, if share prices moved 10 pence, it was a lot. Today, we think it's nothing if they move 20% or 10%. Yeah. I mean, it is an extraordinary time, but I think that what the government has done today will make a significant difference.
Very, very briefly, in a word, will today's bailout, if I can put it that way, fix it? Yes or no?
I don't think it's a bailout, but I think it will do an awful lot to fix it, yes.
So we're on the way?
So we're on the way.
Green shoots?
Not the sort that were being suggested, but I think the sort that Treaty Videra meant, which is in the banking funding market. Right. And among the banks, I think there are some green shoots. Sir
Victor, many thanks for coming in. We do appreciate it. Now, today's numbers. The FTSE 100 closed almost 40 points down at 4108, with finance firms taking a hammering yet again. The US markets were closed for Martin Luther King Day. My number of the day is £17.5 billion. That's the amount of money wiped off the value of UK banks today. They cannot stand much more of this. You've been watching Jeff Randall Live. Tomorrow, there's no programme due to our live coverage of Barack Obama's inauguration. But on Wednesday, I'll be talking to a Russian billionaire and former KGB spy, live from Moscow, and we'll find out what the chairman of Channel 4 makes of plans to merge with Channel 5. Next up, all the top stories here on Sky.